welcome to everyone who's joining us in person and all of our community that is joining us online as well. We are so excited for you to be here at the premiere of Bad Input. Yeah, I paused for you all. After already having chatted with so many of you in the last few minutes, I've gotten to share that one, we've been working on this for over a year, which is a pretty long time to be doing a project, an exciting time for it to finally be out there. And the second part is that I've never watched this with anyone else yet. So I'm really excited to watch this both in person with all of you and to all of our friends online as well right now. And I really want to give an early thank you to so many people who have contributed to this project. We have had a huge crew that involves our filmmaker team, which is Alex Skoo and the team at Logan Industry. We've also had a lot of support from the KPOR Foundation, who have been core collaborators with us, as well as the CR team, our production team, which is Brian Vines, Leah, Andy, and honestly, like dozens of staff members who have touched this in a certain way or another. And that list can go on very long, so I'll stop right there. And I really want to get out of your way so we can actually watch and stream this, but I'm just going to break down the flow for you all right now. We are going to put all 3 videos, it is 3-part documentary series. We're going to stream all 3 of them in one go so that you can see the full glimpse of what we've put together. And then afterwards, we're actually just going to have a short discussion with a couple of us here at the front to talk through some issues and next steps. And then obviously direct you all to take action, because I know you will be geared up to take action after this at badinput.org. So I'm going to get out of the way, and I think I'm just going to check. Brian, we're all good? Okay, great. Thank you, and excited to watch with you.
Is where opportunities and dreams are realized. What that means is that where one lives, right, actually decides what opportunities people have. Home ownership is actually the quickest path to actually get out of poverty and accumulate wealth.
If you want to build wealth, typically building wealth in this country means that you bought a home, right? That you have accessed a mortgage. Well, you're not going to be able to access a mortgage right off the bat if you haven't had a credit history to begin with.
My parents are immigrants from North Africa. They moved to the States in the early 70s, and like so many immigrants, they needed a loan, and yet they couldn't get one. Banks just didn't know how to evaluate their riskiness. If you're from a community that has been historically left out of the mortgage market, as for example, many Black Americans were, it's going to be very hard for you to qualify for additional credit.
Redlining is essentially the institutionalized discriminatory practice of denying an individual financial services, such as mortgage loans, based on factors including their neighborhood's racial or ethnic makeup. And the Fair Housing Act of 1968 outlawed this practice.
Historically, that was done through redlining. That was banks refusing to loan money to Black and brown people based on their zip code. Fortunately, now we are seeing machines replicating those types of traits. We can call it digital redlining, and I don't think that the everyday civilian is aware of the role that algorithms are playing in our day-to-day lives, not just with redlining. If you apply for a loan online, if you're applying for a mortgage online, there's an algorithm behind that.
Making the connection between risk and race, that decision was actually made by humans. Most of the data that we have around in housing now are actually byproduct of those discriminatory policies.
So while I think we've made progress in moving towards a more automated, non-human generated decision, we still have so many people who are left out of our credit system. They haven't been able to access credit in the first place, so they haven't been able to build up a credit history. And yet having a credit history is in part how you get into the system to begin with.
Algorithms have been used to determine whether someone gets a loan, whether someone is approved for a loan, whether someone gets offered housing. And when I say an algorithm, I essentially mean a set of rules that then feed into a machine, and then that machine predicts human behavior.
An average human underwriter probably could only underwrite, let's say, 10 loans a day. But now that we're using tech, so you could have just a system or a process that is driven by algorithm, making underwriting decisions that is probably as little as 1,000 or as high as 10,000 a day.
You can't have underwriting for the digital age and fairness tools for the Stone Age. Bias detection answers the questions, is my algorithm fair? And if not, why not? Bias remediation answers the questions, could my algorithm be fairer? What's the economic impact to my business of being fairer? And finally, did we give our declines, the folks we rejected, a second look?
In order to identify victims of algorithmic harm, we need to have avenues by which that can be investigated and ascertained. If an algorithm is involved in you not getting something important, like insurance or some other thing, you have the right to know.
And if you don't know why they made their decision and on what basis they made that decision, then yeah, you could just have an incorrect assumption that leads you to be denied a job or denied a loan or get different medical care. We don't know the scope to how wrong these decisions are, these algorithmic decisions, because we don't know how they make the decisions, and we don't really essentially know like when we've been impacted by them.
If you build systems that are designed to recognize the inherent flaws in these technologies and compensate for them, I think you can do good.
We want to make sure that every algorithmic solution can be explained to a consumer.
Essentially the bare minimum, if you're going to replace a human decision maker with a computerized one, I think you need to make sure that actually works.
Humans should be involved early to make sure that the data itself isn't biased. Humans should be involved in auditing algorithms periodically. And so I don't think that technology is necessarily the solution. I actually think that human intervention is the solution.
That counties that are majority black have 3 times the rate of infections, 6 times the rate of death. Something is going on here.
Information out from the White House last night on which coronavirus patients are suffering the worst outcomes.
A small medical device can help patients monitor those oxygen levels at home.
They talk about the blue-collar, white-collar divide here.
What works for some may not work for others. The most are usually the ones who participate the least.
After you recognize that skin color could affect these values, then you kind of feel a little dumb that you didn't think about it before. At the University of Michigan, our patient demographics are historically about 80% white, about 10% black. In that early COVID pandemic, that demographic just flipped. We were routinely placing these catheters in people's arteries so that we could check their arterial blood frequently. There was a mismatch between someone's pulse oximeter values and the blood we were getting from their artery. And what a pulse oximeter is a device that measures how much light is transmitted across your fingertip. And so by measuring how much light comes across, we can say, okay, this person has 98% of their blood that's oxygenated, because without it, we would have to sample someone's arterial blood to know what their oxygen level is. And we use this technology so frequently that we depend on it. The care that we provide depends on the quality of the data we receive. But some parts of data that we use all the time, whether it's your vital signs, heart rate, your blood pressure, and nowadays your oxygen saturation is considered kind of a gold standard piece of data that we use and just believe. At first, we thought it was maybe just a COVID problem, right? We thought, hey, there's something unique about COVID where it's causing this mismatch. It was the fact that we were taking care of suddenly so many Black patients, and they were having this mismatch. There have been a handful of studies that have demonstrated clear harm to Black patients as a result of inaccuracies in pulse oximeters. Black patients had higher risk of death due to these pulse oximeters.
So as science technology studies, people call it a socio-technical system of the society that you're using it in, who's building it, who's using it on whom. Then you can see much more clearly how this kind of thing can amplify societal inequities and not fix them.
We're at a pivotal moment. We have an opportunity to correct the wrongs that have already been made in the first several decades of technology's innovation. And if left unchecked, we will continue to, I think, exacerbate inequality, lead to increased polarization, and the technology creation, the products, and the ideas will be concentrated only among a select few, which will not serve our entire global population.
1 in 3 medical students believes that that Black patients experience less pain or experience pain differently, even today. There's this baseline assumption that there are these huge differences between different racial and ethnic groups, and a lot of times it's like modern medicine looks to try to quantify them instead of asking the real question, which is, do they even exist?
Increasingly, we're recognizing that a lot of the tools we use every day are rooted in data that are both very old and very racist. The regulatory approval of pulse oximeters, more than likely the individuals who they were tested on, healthy subjects, were predominantly white men.
So right now, through FDA, Food and Drug Administration, is the body that handles regulation of these AI and these medical devices that use AI, and they suggest doing tests of racial and ethnic bias, but do not require it as part of the clearance or approval process for these devices.
There are many possible different definitions of discrimination or unfairness. Some of them conflict with each other. The first one I always ask is one group experiencing a positive outcome at a higher or lower rate than another group?
If certain people aren't allowed to ask certain questions in their research and in their development of tech, can't be objective and can't be unbiased as a result.
We need to make sure that when these devices come out, that they are regulated in some way, in a correct way that takes into account a diverse group of people.
We need to start from the root, and we need to think about the funding and the reason, the motivation that we're creating this thing for, right?
We don't know what we don't know, and it requires a lot of light bulbs to go off to be able to root out all of these problems from medicine.
He spent 10 days in jail and paid thousands of dollars in legal fees before the case was eventually dismissed for lack of evidence. He's now suing the police and the city of Woodbridge, New Jersey for a violation of his civil rights, false imprisonment, and false arrest. Parks is now the third person known to be wrongfully arrested based on faulty facial recognition technology.
I prefer not to have images of my face taken. Facial recognition is typically looked at as a form of artificial intelligence that is able to detect patterns in a face in order to identify a particular individual. There are companies that have amassed gigantic databases of people's face by scanning images on the web. So whenever you put something on Facebook, whenever you put something on Instagram, if you used to use Flickr, right? If you put it on your own blog, there are companies who scan that, add that to their database, and use that to train and operate their system of facial recognition. One place we might see it where people are very familiar with is the ability to open your iPhone with your face. It softens the ways that it is harmful to society by making it ubiquitous.
We have succumbed to the notion that we should give up our privacy, our anonymity. Your anonymity is such a gift.
To a greater or lesser degree, like everyone in America is being surveilled. It's a control mechanism.
In certain categories, it is very impactful. Like not when they're trying to sell you a product, right? But when it's controlling your access to economic opportunity, I think that's very critical. Or when that tracking can lead you to be prosecuted, right? There's a whole criminal justice angle around, how this tracking is being used against us.
One of the effects, or one of the ways that facial recognition is often used, is to track down people who are engaged in lawful behavior.
And so now, instead of going about my business on a walk or a run or whatever, I'm actually being surveilled by every single house. Who are the people who are gonna be heavily policed?
Anti-Black racism is built into the notion of surveillance. The ways that anti-Blackness and surveillance are linked are run back far in our history, as long as the history of this country. Let's think about that in terms of predicting who's going to be a criminal, deciding who should get a job, who gets a mortgage. Let's think about that in terms of deciding who has their children taken away by the state.
When you're in a position where your identity itself is persecuted, then of course you should value your privacy and think about it very, very carefully. There is research that shows that Black women are recognized with higher error rate. But what happens is not that you don't get identified. What happens is you get misidentified as someone else. So to me, building technology to perpetuate that type of carceral system is very dangerous.
Imperfect surveillance is bad, but perfect surveillance is worse.
I don't think we're too late. I think we are late, absolutely, but I believe in the tech industry to be able to adapt to new rules and new regulations. They can recode, reprogram what they need to work within a fair, more equitable framework around AI regulation. And I think society will be better for it.
Think about the narratives that are put forward by these companies and what those narratives entail. If I have a package that I am expecting and I can't be there, I talk to my neighbor and ask them to look out for it. That makes better neighbors. Streetlights make better neighbors. People feeling safe and secure makes better neighbors.
What we really need is regulation. We need regulation with input from the public, with elected officials by the public to have checks and balances on the use of not just corporations, actually. You have law enforcement and the government itself using some of the technology without really the public understanding the repercussions.
Are we on? Wow, y'all, I said I was so excited to watch this with people, and then I couldn't see any of your faces while I was watching it. And I was like, what are they thinking? So I'm excited to be in front of you all and watching you now. And I'm really excited to bring up Lily and Jason up to the front as we continue the conversation, in which we will talk to both Lily and Jason about the impacts of the videos they've had and played key roles. And then also take some questions from both our in-person audience and our virtual audience. We've got about 1,000 people joining us virtually, which is a really big number. So there are a lot of people excited and watching with you on both ends of the spectrum. And we've got 2 mics, so we're just going to share them throughout. But it is so nice to have you both here. I just wanted to kick off and say thank you so much for the parts of roles that you've contributed to this. You probably saw Jason's star in the video on mortgage lending. It was honestly, the hardest part for me was to not turn around and be like, that's you, that's you. And then I realized every time someone does that to me, I'm like, oh no, don't do that. Yeah. You did not see Lily in the video, but Lily had a huge role to play in the back of the video. So we appreciate all that you have contributed to make this happen. But to start off, I was wondering if you two could just do introductions of yourself. What do you do, your organizations, and then, what role does your work or the organization you work at have a role in creating a more equitable tech future?
Definitely. So I'll say by introducing myself, I'm Lily Genghis. I'm the Chief Tech Community Officer of the Caper Foundation. And if you don't know who we are, you will know after today and after this launch. How many of you are now just really attuned to the nuance and the complexities, but also looking for the potential solutions? Right? Raise your hand in the back. How many? All right. And for the folks who are watching us, I think that this is really one of the most critical moments of our generation. And I speak from a lot of different angles of my own personal journey. I started my career as an engineer, working in hardware and software systems. So I know some of these technologies from a different perspective, but I'm also an immigrant, came as a non-English speaking, came from families that didn't have much of the means, right? And so when seeing the impacts of both on economic opportunity, healthcare, education, surveillance, that all impacts my family members, my friends, my neighbors. It impacts all of the communities that we currently live in. And specifically for the Caper Foundation, we're based out in Oakland, which is the home and the birthplace of the Black Panthers, and so many important racial justice and social justice movements, that we wanted to make sure that as us being based in Oakland, our work is really at the intersection of that history of racial justice, but also at the opportunity that technology can bring. And so the Caper Foundation is part of the Caper Center. So we're all focused on racial justice and technology and looking at it from an ecosystem perspective. And what that enables us to do is to really think about all the different interconnecting points and how things are not just the symptoms, but how can we get to the root of the problems. And so we look at our work as a foundation from K through 12 education to tech pathways to what's happening inside those tech companies through the tech workplace, but as well as entrepreneurship and venture capital. When we were thinking about and seeing who is funding a lot of this technology, where is it coming from, is both the public and the private sector, which is why we're especially excited last year, and through this partnership to really double down on the role that public policy at the intersection of racial justice and technology has. So we're excited to have launched our equitable tech policy work that looks at 9 critical policy issues across this tech ecosystem, and what are the programs that we can be supporting, but what are also the solutions. So we're looking at how we're raising awareness on this topic. So this right here, if you didn't wake up, if you're not awake by now, like, hello, you should be joining us and making sure that we're looking for how to address these issues and really build those solutions, right? But we need an infrastructure. So that's the second part of the work, that we want to make sure that we're building that infrastructure for organizations to do the work day in and day out, the experts that were featured, the organizations, making sure that we're providing that opportunity. And then lastly, we got to mobilize for actions through advocacy. So I want to give a huge shout out to my colleague, Patrick Armstrong, that's in the back, say hello, who's helped, yes, give him some love, who's helping us also lead us to more of what can we do on the policy side. So we'll be sharing a little bit more about that, but I just wanted to share the context and say thank you so much for joining us. And this is the official launch, and I hope that this is a launch of many, many more collaborations and change in our communities.
Okay, so everyone knows about K4 now. Yes. We're all good. We all know.
Not sure how I can follow that. I'm Jason Downs. I'm sort of a part-time lawyer, more of a full-time Uber driver. I got a 7-year-old daughter and a 4-year-old daughter. They make me drive them around the world for karate and stuff like that. But and my day job is, when I'm not driving my kids around, I'm a partner at the Brownstein Law Firm, and I handle government investigations. A part of the government investigations includes trying to keep clients out of government investigations, trying to avoid corporations being investigated, for example, algorithmic discrimination or civil rights violations. And so I do internal civil rights audits for large companies. I do some litigation as well. Prior to being in private practice, I was the Chief Deputy Attorney General for DC. And in that role, my job was to sort of help with policy. We introduced a bill when I was at the AG's office entitled the Stop Discrimination by Algorithms Act. That bill is still pending in the DC City Council right now. We're trying to push it through, although I'm not in the office. And before that, I also helped organize a coalition of 56 chief deputies from across the country, all of which were the number 2 in their office. And the goal was to educate chief deputies as to just basic stuff like what is an algorithm and how on earth are they impacting your constituents and what should we be doing to protect your constituents. I was really fortunate to lead that conference back in 2021. Since then, there have been 3 or 4 other conferences. So I would say the regulatory community is getting up to speed. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. But essentially, my job is to help companies stay out of trouble and avoid civil rights litigation.
And that's all really important work. And just even touching on that somewhat in the videos was so powerful for us to shine a light on and showcase how this has been around for a while. While there's a lot of talk about it right now, these issues have been worked on by people for almost a decade now, as we understand how we're dealing with issues like generative technologies and policies and just new emerging tech that is so integrated into big data. And while I say that, I actually really want to call on each of you to share more about, how we obviously highlighted some issues in the film, but how are big data and algorithmic bias really creeping into the products and services that we use? And why is it impacting communities of color at a different rate? What is it then? Why are we focused so much on specifically in the film's communities of color? And are there other communities that you're thinking about as well?
Sure, I'll start us off only because I have the microphone in my hand, and then I'll pass it over. So, I should start this answer by saying I do think that there are a lot of really positive uses for artificial intelligence. And it creeps up in our day-to-day lives. If you're using Siri, you're using artificial intelligence. If you use any online platforms that suggest products or suggest services, then you're using artificial intelligence. If you apply for a loan and you get approved in a matter of minutes, then you've used artificial intelligence. So there are a lot of really good uses, but I would say that we do have to be vigilant for or related to communities of color because humans are designing these algorithms that feed into artificial intelligence. They're designed by humans, they're developed by humans. And what they rely on is historical data to predict the future. And as all of us know, not everyone acknowledges, but all of us know that our history is full of bias. And if we're not vigilant, then that bias that our history is full of can creep into algorithms and the artificial intelligence and then the outputs that they're producing. So we just have to be vigilant. And so I don't want to make it seem like it's all gloom and doom and that, AI is terrible for society. There are many, many positive uses, but we just have to be very, very vigilant and understand that historical biases can and do often creep into AI.
What I'll share as well to that, right? That there's all that, yes, there are other problems, but there's also a lot of opportunities. I think one of the challenges is who is getting to decide those opportunities, right? And so the whenever I speak to communities, especially communities of color in different instances, it's always like, we're all tech already, depending whether you're somebody who maybe those examples that you shared, how you're listening to your music, but also the workers, right? I think about my mom and the way she got displaced when a new medical billing got introduced into her career, and she didn't have the right supports and upskilling at her job to be able to stay up to date. That impacted our family financially, it impacted her emotionally. So all of this, these challenges of how we're seeing technology, our goal is really to show that it's not for the few, right? It's impacting us all, and we all need to have an opportunity in being part of the design. And so specifically at the Caper Center, where we focus on who is being part of this ecosystem. This is why we look at it as an ecosystem from the K through 12 education, who has access to computer science in their classrooms. Raise your hand if you ever had the opportunity when you were in school, had the opportunity to have computer science, robotics classes. Okay, a few. I didn't have any of that in my high school. Out in part of the LAUSD, growing up in LA, I had to be bussed into the richer school because my high school didn't have the resources for me to participate in these programs. So out of the bat, when I'm already in high school, I'm not able to participate, right? And so here are some barriers, some structural barriers. And then yet, despite all that, had opportunities to pursue engineering. Fast forward, I got to graduate from electrical engineer, which back then was one of the hardest ones, right? I didn't know going into those classrooms, the different systemic barriers I would face. Going fast forward into my first job in the aerospace industry, where it was all classified environment, didn't know what I was building, but yet there I am being probably one of the few women, definitely one of the youngest in some of my teams, but also literally the only Latina and the only person of color in a lot of these rooms, where a lot of huge, as I got to learn now because of the Caper Center, and now I have the language, but all these big decisions that impact not just my mom, my generation, but impacts the next generation were being made. And when we think about the vigilance that we need to have, especially if you are in those rooms as designers, creators, whether you're testing it or you're trying to market it, everyone has a role from the inside of the companies as well as externally, but also in the public sector, right? And so we want to make sure that everyone has an opportunity because we're all tech now. And so we want to make sure that we're also being educated on what that role means. But it also has a huge opportunities if we think about the economic opportunity that we have, right? And just in the pandemic 2020, when we were all we weren't able to gather in this beautiful space, and we know that New York was also ground zero for some of the hardest challenges. There was a select few tech companies that made over $1 trillion in value that they added to them, right? There was 12 million plus tech employees who are averaging 150 plus salary versus your 45K average, right? So when you think of the discrepancy, and then when we think about how we currently gather all of our news and the social media, how we were able to connect in those times that we were disconnected, more than 3/4 of the folks living in the US, if you have access to a mobile phone, that's how we were consuming all your information, being able to have an opportunity to have a job. And so I think these are things that are very critical and very important. And we want to make sure that things are not just by accident or by luck, but we want to make sure that we're really addressing the systemic barriers across, right? And we wanted these three videos to really double click on 3 specific areas that also have some of the biggest harms. There's a lot of different ways that these biases shows, but these sometimes are in who has access to homes, who has access to healthcare, who has access to freedom. So we want to make sure that we're centering it also on the real life consequences. But there's many more, and so we're excited to be able to think about who is not in the room that needs to be in the room. Who do we invite to make sure that they're also part of the solution?
And I love that you both came out talking about the opportunities because, you know, after looking at these videos, you're like, oh my gosh, there's so much harm. And I find myself in a space where we're right now in a mode in the world. The future is digital, but the future is now. I don't know, where all of these opportunities have come up and so many people are sharing them and feeling them. And I'm so excited. And there's a few of us on the side raising our arms in the air saying, wait, we don't have everyone. We've got to stop. We've got to slow down. We've got to get this right, because if we don't, the impact of what that feels and looks like can be really harmful. And I think so much of what you have both just shared and so much of the vision for these videos was doing that, was saying, we have to slow down to make sure we're getting this right, because even if you look at the second video, in terms of healthcare, people's lives are at stake. And we need to have that discussion and fix and work on this before we move forward. So I really appreciate both those answers. And Jason, I actually want to pull on a thread where you were talking about regulation earlier. Sure. And at the end of the videos, we talk a lot about regulation, corporate accountability, how do we make these changes? And those are pretty big discussions happening around the world for every country, federal, state level in the US. And I'm curious on your take, like where where do we stand and what do we need right now? And even Lily, like how do organizations and movements and communities push towards those?
Yeah, I'm glad that you started that by asking where do we stand now, because that's a really important component of the question, because we have laws on the books now that can be enforced to prevent or to remedy discrimination. And you don't need to look much further than a joint letter that was released last week by 4 or 5 different federal government agencies. You've got the Department of Justice, Civil Rights, you've got the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, the CFPB, which is the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, and the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, all of which came together, all of which said there are federal laws on the books, and none of those federal laws have any exemptions for artificial intelligence, right? So that's the starting point. We have laws on the books. For example, the Civil Rights Division of DOJ, Department of Justice, intervened in a federal lawsuit that is related to housing discrimination. And the thrust of DOJ intervening is to say, look, if there is an algorithm being used, if there's, artificial intelligence being used to screen tenants, and that artificial intelligence is considering things like credit history, where, by the way, minority communities, as you saw in the documentary, had less opportunities to build credit. So if you're taking that into consideration, but you're failing to consider things like the person has a housing voucher, so they can use that housing voucher to pay their bills, right? So if you're not taking that into consideration, who are you harming? And the answer to that is minority communities. And so that's an example of a federal law that is already on the books that can be enforced today. We don't have to wait. I can give you others. I know that I don't want to go too long. I can talk about ECOA, which is a sort of the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, which would require a credit card agency or any financial institution that issues an adverse financial decision. In other words, you apply for a loan, you're denied, or you're not given the loan on those terms. If that's the case, the law as it stands today says that that entity has to tell you why. That's the law. If that entity is using an algorithm or artificial intelligence to deny a loan or to take an adverse position, that entity still has to tell you why they did it. If they're using a black box they don't understand, that's not a defense, right? And I could give you other examples. The point I'm making is there are already laws on the books. To answer your second question, what do we need? We have to make sure that our regulators understand how AI works. We have to make sure they have the tools they need to combat this discrimination. But I think that we have some existing laws on the books that we should enforce.
Thank you for sharing that, because I think that's a really great example of all the existing tools, the nuances, and the strategies that can be applied if we have the will, right? And so I think that's why it's really critical. Also, again, just saying thank you to the Consumer Reports team for just bringing this awareness into an everyday person, because that's actually what's needed when we think about the role that public policy has. And Dr. Gilbert said it very clearly. We need the public, but the public also needs to know what's happening, right? And it's very unfair to put all this immense, basically barrier of understanding, right? You have to be a civil rights lawyer to be able to advocate for yourself. We shouldn't have to be designing these systems that way. Everyone should have an opportunity to do that. So I would zoom out of like the roles that are specifically grassroots organizations have in this time is very, very critical. And there are a lot of different great organizations that we're hoping to also share in the badinput.org. So if you have organizations that you recommend, if you're an organization leader, please reach out, so then that way we can help amplify the work. So that way we can also zoom out on the different strategies, because there's a few that I'll share really briefly. But there's what's the internal company policy, right? So we were seeing these big tech companies that I mentioned that added trillions of dollars. Those are the same ones that have had large layoffs. Those are the same ones that are pushing towards their AI initiatives, not by coincidence. These are a lot of different strategic decisions being made internally. But this is why internal tech policy is important, because we got to think about who are the creators, who are the designers. And a lot of the reports that the Caper Center has published, we know that specifically Black, Latinx, we tend to hover under 7-6%. And now after some of these big tech layoffs, those numbers are still to be defined, right? So when you think about when we're 18, 20 growing plus percent of the entire US population, and yet we're still significantly underrepresented in the design, right? Where you get to decide who's going to be impacted, who gets to also benefit monetarily, but also who doesn't bear the shoulder of the impact, right? And so this is why having, not when we think about like representation matters, yes, it does, when it's also applied into some of these big decisions. So we need to be part of the decision making as creators. And so I have a mentor that always used to say, if you can build it, should you build it? And just because you can scale it, should you scale it? Those are the questions that we really need to also be bringing into the inside those tech companies, but also to our education, right? So what does the next tech worker look like that is also making some of these decisions? How are the CEOs making these decisions? How are they being held accountable? That's inside the companies. Externally, and the public policy, we have, especially in the US, we have the federal, the state, the city level, the county level, but we also want to make sure that we're being aware of also the global implications that this has, right? Because just because you're building it in one specific part of the world, it impacts everyone. And so I think that this is a part that I encourage folks who are in this space to please join the conversation, help us also learn, or what are the things that are needed on a global perspective? Because right now, most of the conversation, and at least on the policy side, is being dominated by the EU and the US. But we know that there's also folks in Africa who the work of a lot of the ChatGPT was outsourced, and who's doing some of the hardest manual work, right? And so we want to make sure that we also understand the different levers that we have on a global and as a nation, but also as workers inside the economy. And there's great organizations that have been doing this work for many, many years, like DAR, AJL, and so many other thought leaders, specifically women of color researchers that have been at the forefront of all this. So I really encourage you all to learn more about that and make sure that we're uplifting their work of many, many generations.
Lily is doing my job for me. It's great. Telling you all to come on board. I love it. One thing I just want to tap on is, like, Jason, you have one of my favorite lines of the film. Actually, don't tell any of the other speakers that.
I'll take it.
To be honest, I have like 20 favorite lines of the films. But you, in one of the videos, you say, what we don't need right now is technical intervention. What we need is human intervention. And I just, between the two of you, like, that line is just ringing in my head. And it's been ringing in my head for a very long time, because in all these systems, we need humans coming in to do this stuff, to really connect these dots for a lot of people.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. I mean, just to put a fine point on it, it's not as if we should build these great systems or these great models and just leave them, right? We need to build them and then review them, specifically review their outputs on a fairly regular basis. So to the extent, I mentioned earlier, look, we've got laws on the books. I agree with that. But to the extent that we are enacting new laws, whether on the local, state, or federal level, part of those laws should include when should humans be involved and how often, right? I think that should be part of any new statute that has been introduced. New York is actually in part leading the way on that. There was a New York City statute enacted related to algorithms and audits that should be conducted on a fairly regular basis. That should be, I think, part of the conversation, whether we're talking about federal legislation or other states.
Yeah, of course. I have so many more questions, and I'm not going to ask them, because I would like to actually pass over to the community that's joining us virtually and the ones in the audience. I think we have enough time for 2 questions. So if there's anyone here, I didn't even finish my sentence. Cool. No, that was you in the front over here. Do you want to ask a question?
Yeah, some of these systems, like neural networks, have this characteristic where we have a hard time understanding what happens inside of them. And so how do we deal with human intervention with systems who work, like they have outputs that we like, but we don't fully understand how they get to those outputs?
Okay, before you answer, I'm just going to repeat the question for our virtual audience. And I want to make sure I get this right. how do we ensure that the outputs that are being reviewed are, sorry, can you finish the sentence?
Specifically neural networks, which are extremely popular.
Specifically neural networks.
Have this black box characteristic whereby we don't fully understand what happens within the layers.
Okay.
So I will be quick here and say, if you can't, I would advise my clients. I've had this conversation with a senior vice president who, at a Fortune 50 company, he meant well, and he didn't really have a solid understanding of sort of how the black box was working and how it got to a particular output. My answer was, you're putting your company at a massive risk by continuing to use this if you can't articulate it. If transparency is important for lots of reasons, and if we don't have transparency, you got, as a company, that company has real risk. And I would not advise my client to use that technology if you can't articulate it.
I think to just add that briefly, there's to your point, right? What's the level of transparency? I think the other part is also the business level, right? There's brand partners that we have, like Free Press, Color of Change, DAR, AJA, all these different organizations that have been working in coalition as well to take a look at how are these types of companies also profiting from what's being optimized. And if you can't have, also to your point, the transparency, what risks are you also adding, not just to your own company as itself, to your shareholders, but ultimately your end customers as well, and the unintended consequences. So I think that's really where the conversation is at. What's the level of transparency that is really needed, and how do we get there? And if you can't explain how you're building something, then should you not be held accountable, or should you, right? So those are, I think, some of the current complex situations where I think it's important to also have the experts be able to weigh in on the different angles as well.
Yeah. I'm going to read a question that we've gotten from our online audience, who I have heard is very engaged. So thank you so much for participating with us. What if the algorithm has home ownership as a factor that is input? While that is not an obvious race factor, but since home ownership is far less for POCs, the output might have racial bias.
What a good question. So what the question involves proxy discrimination, and so so an algorithm using a set of factors. Those factors do not have to explicitly mention protected classes like race or gender or veteran status or age. If there's a proxy for race, for example, home ownership, you're putting your company at risk. Let me give you an example very similar to what the question just asked. One of my clients was using a hiring algorithm, and the hiring algorithm was taking into account graduation year. And we had a 3-hour conversation about whether or not that company really needed graduation year, because that could arguably be a proxy for age. What you're really asking is, well, how many years of experience do you have in X? That's really what you're trying to get at. The graduation year, that's probably a proxy for age. I'm not so sure we should use it. That particular client say, you know what, we're going to scrap it. This particular question that involves home ownership is very similar. Like, you're using home ownership, which could be a proxy for race. I would ask, what exactly are you trying to get at? And is there a different way we can get at this? Do we really need to use home ownership, or can we use something else? Another thing that comes up in that in proxy is SAT scores. And SAT scores in the financial services industry, SAT scores predict high school graduation rates predict repayment. And so a lot of people will say, we're going to use SAT scores. And I say, be very, very careful, because SAT scores arguably are historically biased, and there's a lot of data that shows that. So be very careful. Do you really want to use that, or is there something else we can use to get at that?
I'm really glad you used that as an example, because someone online earlier was asking about age redlining. And that's actually something that I have not talked much about or heard much about, and is not very discussed in many of the circles I'm in. And your example was so clear into how that comes in and plays that bias in a way where it is unnecessary information. Yeah. Okay, we're just about at time, so I am going to wrap us up. But I do want Jason, this is the first time you've watched the video. He admitted that to me earlier. I'm gonna put him on the spot. I told him, I was like, I've watched them 1,000 times. He's like, this is gonna be my first. And I was like, okay, great, we'll do this together. Now that you are here live in New York, and it's the first time you've watched the videos, how do you feel?
Smarter. I'm around people that are a lot smarter than me, and I'm like, man, I've got a lot to learn. The videos were awesome. The medical device, I learned a lot about medical devices there. And I will also mention being in the room out there. I think I was talking to Jenny, maybe her name, and oh my gosh, I learned a whole lot just talking to her. So just being in the room, I've gotten smarter. So thank you for inviting me.
We love Jenny. Lily, you have watched this many times as part of our team, and you were here also in New York with us today. Like, how are you feeling coming out of this?
So you know what, I'm looking forward to, after this, talking to people one-on-one, because at the beginning, after seeing this, I'm like, is this going to be so like doomsday, right? Because I'm like, we understand this are the challenges, but I'm also like, how can we change this, right? Because we're right at that time. We're not too late, but if we, delay, we will. And so we want to make sure that we're taking that responsibility that we each have, right? And the privilege that we all have to be here, to be like, what's the opportunity? What's the hopefulness? So I'm feeling very optimistic, to your point, being in this space, being able to have these really thoughtful conversations. So thank you for just lending also your expertise and helping us, guiding us through some of these really complex situations, right? And that's just in one sector. What does it look like in all these different sectors that we have yet to explore more deeply? And that part makes me optimistic because of the people, because of who is able to be reached by these topics. We also have it in Spanish, because we're going to also help make sure that we get all the folks who remove those barriers of language. So then that way we're able to also include more of our population that's being directly impacted, right, by AI and the impact of automation. So I'm excited about the people that will join in the conversations, in the solutions, and helping us think about, as a public space, what are the right governance levels? What are the right accountability levels? What can we do as individuals? What can we do as a community? What can we do as an institution? And so just really looking forward to the possibilities as people gain more awareness, get inspired, get fired up to change this, because a lot of this stuff has been based on past data, right? And so how do we make sure that we're also creating new data, new opportunities, new visions for how technology could actually close gaps of access?
Yeah. And since I know you're all wondering how I'm feeling, I'm going to
How are
answer
you
as
feeling,
well. It's been a journey to get here and just taking it in. And I feel like that's been so much of today in the big launch. And I'm particularly excited to invite so many people to share this special day with us, and encourage you all to go back to badinput.org. Check out the organizations you can take action with, watch the videos again. You can watch them in Spanish as well. There's so many resources and organizations and toolkits we have available on there, that it is an interactive space. We really want to encourage you to go to and sign the petition that we have there as well, to take action now for audits to be reviewed at a federal level related to algorithmic bias. Jason, Lily, thank you so much. I've appreciated this.
Thank you. Special thank you to the entire CR team for just please, let's give them some love. The entire CR team over the last year. I think it's just, we thought about like this collaboration before all these headlines, right? Because there's been so much work being done. And I think the moment of meeting the moment, the opportunities here. So I just want to say thank you for entrusting, and for the community. Let's get engaged, and thank you especially to you for guiding us, and Leah and the rest of the team as well. So thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you to our online viewers. We will chat more with you later and send you lots of links. We appreciate you. And to those of us in person, I hope you will come join me for some snacks and beverages outside, and we can chat more.